Friends, at this moment, what I would call the most dangerous knot in this entire war is happening. Not because missiles are being fired again over 5,000 kilometers, not because the Hormuz Strait is closed, open, then closed again, but because the negotiations between the US and Iran are the only chance to end this story without a new war. Right now, they don't depend on Washington or Tehran, but on what Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon. And today I'll explain to you why this is the case, who is really deceiving whom in this game, and I'll offer my own plan. What needs to be done to cut this knot? Not to untie it, but to cut it. First, let's figure out exactly what Iran is demanding, what its claims are regarding Lebanon and Hezbollah. Then what America is demanding in response, and why this demand sounds like an ultimatum. And then why neither side is backing down, even though both understand they've reached a dead end. And finally, my personal suggestion, which I think could cut this Gordian, or maybe not Gordian, knot. So Iran's demands. On June 18, Trump and Pezeshkian signed the Islamabad Memorandum. The document is simple in essence. If hostilities cease on all fronts for 60 days, the U.S. lifts the naval blockade, and Iran opens the Hormuz Strait for shipping. It would seem everything is clear, but as usual, the devil is in the details, and the main detail is called Lebanon. From the very beginning, Iran included one strict condition in its agenda. The ceasefire should apply not only to direct strikes on Iranian territory, but also to Israel's operation against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Tehran's logic here is perfectly clear. Hezbollah is an Iranian asset, raised, armed, and financed for decades. It's not just an ally, it's an investment, and a very costly one. To allow this investment to be destroyed at the very moment when Iran itself sits down at the negotiating table to save what's left of its nuclear program, of its regime, it means losing strategic depth across the entire Middle Eastern front. That's why Tehran is acting according to a pattern we've already seen. On June 1st, even before the memorandum was signed, the Iranian Tasnim agency reported the suspension of negotiations. The formal pretext was the Israeli offensive and capture of Beaufort Fortress. The head of Iran's foreign ministry, Arakchitada, stated the following literally: "A violation of the ceasefire on one front means a violation on all fronts at once. And the responsibility for this lies with the U.S. and Israel." Notice the wording, not just Israel, but the U.S. and Israel. This is fundamental. I'll explain why a bit later. After the memorandum was signed, the situation repeated itself almost exactly. Israel did not stop its operation in Lebanon. On the contrary, it expanded it. They struck Hezbollah targets in the Bekaa Valley. This was justified by claiming ceasefire violations by the other side. And Tehran, and by the way, yes, they did violate it. During a ceasefire, any ceasefire in the Middle East, there's shooting. So, well, not only in the Middle East, but in Eastern Europe too. And Tehran once again started using the threat of ending dialogue as a tool of pressure. That is, they believe they can threaten to suspend the dialogue. Now, against the backdrop of technical negotiations in Bürgenstock. So what are America's demands now? Here's the catch. Washington isn't just sitting silently and nodding at Iran's demands. The Americans have their own list of demands which they present not to Israel, but specifically to Iran. It goes something like this. Do you want us to stop Israel? First, stop your Hezbollah. Stop supplying them with money. Stop providing them with weapons. Make them go silent on the Lebanese front, and then we'll talk about how we can hold back the Israelis. Trump put forward these demands almost as an ultimatum, right in the middle of the negotiations in Switzerland. Immediately force your Lebanese proxies to cease fire. Under the threat, of course, of new powerful strikes from the US, not just Israel. So, the formula looks like this. Iran says, stop Israel. America responds, you stop Hezbollah first. And both sides are basically demanding the impossible of each other, because neither of them really controls their partner 100%. Well, all right. Well, maybe Iran controls Hezbollah by about 95%. But by and large, Israel isn't even controlled by America by 95%. And here I have to say something especially important and quite unexpected, something that directly concerns the Russian-speaking diaspora, and how this story can affect a completely different region far from the Middle East at first glance. I'll talk about this a bit later in detail, because it requires special attention. But for now, let's get back to our main topic, because without understanding this knot, it's impossible to understand what will happen next. Now, why is neither side backing down? Here's the key point that I really want you to understand. From a military standpoint, Iran has lost this war completely. Killed. Supreme Leader Khamenei has been killed. The fleet in the Gulf of Oman has been destroyed. Dozens of military facilities have been wiped out. The nuclear centers in Vodonze and Fardo have been bombed, right? Tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. And on the Iranian side, the number of dead soldiers is in the thousands. Soldiers and hundreds of civilian deaths. This is not an exchange. This is a defeat. Well, that's the paradox. A military defeat does not mean there are no levers of pressure. Besides Hormuz, Iran still has a very effective trump card. That's Hezbollah. And the very fact that the ceasefire in Lebanon depends on the goodwill of Tehran, at least in words, is already a serious lever or trump card. Iran understands perfectly well that as long as there is a formal threat that negotiations will collapse, it has leverage. To push for the lifting of sanctions, unfreezing of assets, access to working groups on reconstruction and economic development. That is exactly what Tehran announced after Bürgenstock on June 23. 4 working groups on lifting sanctions, on the nuclear program, on reconstruction, and on monitoring. This is not a gift. This is what Iran is bargaining for at the cost of threatening to derail the roundtable. On the other hand, Israel. Netanyahu has stubbornly made it clear that he does not intend to withdraw the military presence from Yugoslav. And here is the most important legal detail, without which it is impossible to understand this situation fairly. Israel did not sign the memorandum of June 18. This is a document between the U.S. and Iran. Israel did not participate in it and formally does not bear any obligations under it. Therefore, when Tehran says or writes that Israel is violating the agreement, that's rhetoric, not a legal fact. You can only violate what you've signed or promised, like he did with me, then broke it. Israel didn't sign or promise anything to anyone. It ends up being a very interesting situation. The accusation of violation is actually addressed to someone who didn't make any promises, not to the one who did. The promise to ceasefire on all fronts was made by America and Radu, and to fulfill this promise on behalf of a third party, on behalf of its sovereign ally, who, like Tessia, did not make any commitments, is something Washington cannot do. Well, unless they put heavy pressure on Netanyahu himself. And this is where America's real weak spot emerges, directly on the eve of the midterm elections on November 3rd, when Trump's approval rating is already at a historic low. To openly and harshly pressure him would be politically extremely painful. And that means Iran has a second lever as well. The understanding that Washington is especially vulnerable in domestic politics right now. That means dragging things out and demanding more and more is advantageous and relatively safe. That's why neither side truly stops. Iran considers itself weak, but, well, not crushed. That is, defeated in a military sense, but still having enough leverage to squeeze out the maximum before a final settlement. Israel considers itself strong and unbeatable on the battlefield in the Middle East, so it doesn't see any reason to stop. Moreover, military successes against Hezbollah are seen inside the country as a victory that shouldn't be cut short, and America is caught in the crossfire. It needs a deal with Iran. That's its main achievement this year. But it can't and doesn't want to put as much pressure on Israel as would be necessary to make this deal happen. And here's my suggestion. I usually make ordinary suggestions, especially on military and political matters. But here I want to express my own position. What I would suggest to Israel and America, if I could, so to speak, sit at the table if someone invited me there. Stop pretending that negotiations with Iran and the operation against Hezbollah are two parallel coexisting processes. That's not the case. It's one process. And as long as Hezbollah physically exists as an organization capable of shooting, it will remain the main bargaining chip and the main obstacle to any agreement. That's why my proposal is simple and perhaps tough. Temporarily suspend negotiations with Iran altogether. Completely. And focus on only one task, to destroy Hezbollah specifically.
Причем окончательно.
Not to weaken, not to push them back across the river or to the border, but to wipe them out as a military and political structure from the face of the earth in southern Lebanon. After that, the critically important second step is to transfer all the liberated territory under the control of the regular Lebanese army. Do not leave a gray zone, do not leave a vacuum that Hezbollah will fill again in 6 months. Officially declare, proclaim, here, this is the territory of Lebanon. It is under the control of the Lebanese state, and no one else, neither Hezbollah nor any other armed group, has the right to enter there. Period. And only after that should we go back to Iran and say, guys, the problem is solved. There is no longer any reason for conflict on the Lebanese front. Now let's have substantive negotiations on the nuclear program and sanctions without getting distracted by minor issues or manipulations through proxies. Do you understand the logic? Right now, both sides are holding each other hostage through a third force, through Hezbollah. Iran uses it as leverage in the negotiations, and Israel uses the operation against it as an excuse to ignore diplomatic pressure from Washington. And the Americans are caught in the crossfire because they can't make either side stop for good. Take Hezbollah out of the equation physically, and negotiations with Iran will immediately become much cleaner, because the main subject of manipulation would simply disappear. Yes, it's a tough solution, yes, but it requires military determination to see it through to the end, not to stop halfway, as often happens. But the alternative is an endless merry-go-round in which Iran will drag things out until the very last day, before the elections, before the U.S. Congress elections, squeezing the maximum concessions out of this uncertainty because they understand perfectly well the closer it gets to November, the less political capital Trump has for putting strong pressure on Israel. You know, I have so much material, so many events happening at the same time, both here and on this channel and on other platforms, that I physically can't manage to tell everything in one episode. So if you have the time and desire, check out my Telegram channel. It's Leon Weinstein, spelled exactly the same way as on this channel, the same on Telegram. There I briefly share the most important things. When there's something, so to speak, really interesting, but it either doesn't warrant a long video or it's urgent and I need to say something quickly, it's not like a mandatory subscription, just a small tool to stay informed. I think you'll find it interesting. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there are so many events happening right now that our next meeting definitely won't be long in coming. So, see you soon, friends, until we meet again.